Hey guys. So I'll never not be compelled to talk about Game of Thrones on like a daily basis, even though it does feel like revisiting an abuser, but for a very long time, I've wanted to discuss arguably the best sequence in the entire show. And yes, there are plenty to pick from. Some might say Ned's death, some might say the Red Wedding, but I think there's something preeminently special about watching this blonde lady go full lighter fluid Yagami on all of her enemies. But aside from the immaculate composition of the scene itself, I think much of the grandeur that came from that dazzling green fireball was born of the build-up that came before it. Which makes a lot of pennies and dimes, because Season 6 of Game of Thrones had a lot of heavy lifting to do, considering that Season 5 of Game of Thrones was huffing paint thinner for like a third of its runtime. But ignoring some nearly objectively terrible storytelling choices,
you want a good girl, but you need the bad pussy.
Whenever you're ready, my lord.
the finale of Season 5 is what established Cersei's entire journey through Season 6. The exact religious nutjobs that she empowered in order to take down her enemies had started spreading their grubby little self-flagellating hands all over King's Landing until she lost control of them. I'm not gonna lie, there was a sweet satisfaction in seeing the most wretched woman in all of Game of Thrones go through an on-screen ego death where she had to grovel and beg for even the most basic treatment. In psychology, the term used for enjoying the sight of someone else's suffering is Schadenfreude, but I don't speak German, so I just call it delicious. Seeing the difference between Cersei's smug, self-satisfied face when she tried to intimidate Littlefinger in Season 1 versus her pathetic, open-palmed, prostrated truckling to the High Sparrow in Season 5 literally feels like visual candy. And to top it off, of course, this wretched, vile she-villain was forced to surrender every ounce of pride that she had by walking through the city naked and being spit on by the citizens she looked down upon. Granted, this is not a defense or endorsement of the Sparrow's treatment of Cersei or anybody else. They freaking mutilated people, broke their bodies and minds with incessant torture, and indoctrinated them into a cult when they lost the will to resist. They're all bad. But the enemy of my enemy is a sea anemone because I enjoy watching them sting people I don't like. And I really didn't like Cersei. But all of that was the bedrock for Season 6, which in my opinion is a highly underrated season of the show. Regardless of all the great individual scenes within, I will give specific applause to how the showrunners upped the ante with the King's Landing plotline. The High Sparrow and his burlap sack sycophants just kept thwarting every attempt to defeat him. On one hand, there was kind of a guilty pleasure in seeing the actual Game of Thrones being dominated by a bunch of poor people with butcher knives, simply because these rich noble bastards were so out of touch that they didn't know how to compete against them. It was like a mini revolution, something that I think us struggling millennials can identify with, considering the state of our modern noble class.
So I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all this.
But on the other hand, which is the bad hand, the Sparrows were starting to become worse than any of the villains on the show ever were. At least Joffrey and Cersei and Tywin could be reasoned with. They had wants and needs that made them socially human. The High Sparrow was more like a Pope Borg who functioned purely off the suffering of infidels. Heck, he became the villain that caused the other villains and the heroes to join forces, and they still couldn't beat him. Marjorie became so out of answers that she just pretended to be indoctrinated to save her family. And because of all this, Cersei's back was against a wall in a way that we had never seen before. She had been stripped of pretty much all political and social power, separated from her family, either from religious differences or death, and was slated to be tried and executed herself. The game in Game of Thrones was always played within the bounds of the system established by the rich and powerful, but Cersei slowly realized that there was no way for her to win in that system. So instead, she did one of the most baller moves that I have ever seen. You know how like Shaquille O'Neal would just break backboards to end professional basketball games? Or how Frieza would just blow up the planet he was on if he was losing to someone? Cersei did that, but with the system. She blew up the system. There was no negotiating or secret alliances or moral arguments like in the previous seasons. She just decided to kill everybody. And what a beautiful way the director chose to showcase her psychosis. The musical track was a haunting, rising crescendo of piano keys, an instrument never before used for a Game of Thrones episode. It immediately told you something was off, but in the most regal, elegant, and sinister way possible. There was hardly any dialogue, too. It gave way to just superb action. We saw the characters and slowly came to the same horrifying realizations alongside them. Bombing the Sept seemed too crazy to be an option, but Cersei had already committed to going full dictator mode. She managed to kill every single one of her domestic enemies, along with a bunch of the small folk that mocked her, and drank wine and smiled while doing it. Hate her or love her, and there definitely should be one of those two, Cersei single-handedly redefined the rules for the Game of Thrones. She took power as queen while not having an ounce of royal blood in her. She ended the season with the literal biggest bang in the show's history, which is saying something. It's all this stuff that's fantastic and good and well executed, and all this lead up that makes me so angry about how season 7 and 8 were handled. Cersei essentially nuked the Vatican, gave a live cremation to the Pope, and then usurped the throne. And it appeared like nobody in King's Landing cared. The rest of the people in the show, even the main characters, barely reacted to this, insane event. There was no outcry from the small folk or continued religious rebellion. The Sparrow plotline and all of its repercussions just kind of disappeared in season 7. Truly, I think season 6 was the last great season of the show, mainly because it wasn't rushed to piss. But hey, what do I know? I'm just some guy on the internet who didn't ruin the biggest show in the history of the universe. If you like what you heard, do the commenting thing. It helps a lot. Also, I made a TikTok. I will put a link for that down in the description below. Tell me what you want me to talk about next. Thanks for staying to the end of my rant. If you want my services for editing or want to check out my books, I will leave a link for my website as well. As always, it was a pleasure, and I'll talk to you all again soon.